faith schools, and in particular Muslim schools, are they divisive or do they facilitate integration? I'll introduce the panel first. To my right, we have Alistair Smith, who's lecturer in education at London University's Institute of Education, and who is a history teacher and has been teaching for a long time in a London comprehensive school. Then we have Sister Rebecca Williams, who converted to Islam 11 years ago. She worked for Interfaith in Bradford and delivered Islamic assemblies in the local schools. She's currently a Link Governor trainer for Birmingham Local Authority, and she has 3 children. So she's here basically as a Muslim community worker and as a parent, I would say. Then to my right, we've got Brother Tahir Allen, who's chairman of the Education Committee of the Muslim Council of Britain. He's been a school governor and trains other people to develop the skills to become school governors. And then we've got Brother Ibrahim Hewitt, former chairman of the Islamia Schools Trust and the chairman of the British Muslim charity Interpal. He's also the head of Al-Aqsa Primary School in Leicester. And as everybody who knows Brother Ibrahim knows, he's got a wealth of experience in this field. Now, myself, as your chair, my name is Michelle Misaudi, and I've been involved in education for many, many years. I came from France in the very early 70s and taught continuously in maintained schools. Then I was involved in setting up Muslim schools and was head of 2 different Muslim schools. And I've been currently a school inspector. And as a school inspector, I'm inspecting state schools and Muslim schools. And I've been inspecting over 30 Muslim schools over the past 2 years, as well as a considerable number of state schools. So I'd like to present some bare facts before we open this debate. Fact number 1, the vast majority of Muslim pupils in this country are in maintained schools, and that's well over 80%. Fact number 2, there are over 120 Muslim schools in the UK at the moment, and they're mushrooming by the minute almost. I'm aware of new registration visits having to take place every month. So it's an expanding phenomenon. Fact number 3, we know that nationally in maintained schools, Muslim pupils are not achieving well at all, and that's an understatement, to the extent that there had to be several government initiatives, the latest of which was the minority ethnic achievement initiative that focused on Turkish, Somali, Bangladeshi, Pakistani pupils in the last 2 years to seek ways of raising the standards at Key Stage 3 in maintained schools. And the last fact is that, contrary to this picture in maintained schools, our pupils are doing rather well in Muslim schools. And in fact, a few Muslim schools have hit the headlines repeatedly over the past 5 years with outstanding achievement. I mean, I'll give you one figure that comes to mind, Feversham College in Bradford, where each girl attained 6 A stars in GCSEs. We'll take questions from the audience in about 20 minutes, and I propose that we start the debate by asking each speaker to speak for about 5 minutes and put forward their views. So, Alistair?
Right. Establishing some basic principles which I think are really important, and these relate really to the right of equality under the law that Muslim parents and children have to have separate religious schools. The vast majority of faith schools, and if we're talking about the state sector, there are 24,000 state schools in this country. 7,000 of those are faith schools. Of those, 4,000 odd are Church of England, 2,000 are Catholic. I think there are 26 Jewish schools, 5 Muslim state schools, and only 2 Sikh schools. So the right to have faith schools is a basic equal right, and I completely endorse that right. The other thing, a basic principle, is to understand why people might feel that faith schools are a solution, and I think this is partly to do with the climate of Islamophobia that has existed and escalated in the last decade, and the need for a sense of the sense of inequality and the need for justice, I think, is part of the backdrop to that. I also want to just totally reject some of the arguments that circulate around the media that, for example, faith schools, Muslim faith schools have been singled out as being breeding grounds for extremism. And one report, I think it was a Tory reporter, said that these would undermine British national identity, and I want to totally reject those. Just one last principle as well that I want to raise, one issue, is that I think the issue of faith schools has come into the debate recently, partly because the politicians who've been discussing this are using it in a bit of a divide and rule way. And one of the issues has been the use of what are called city academies. These are new schools, independent state schools, and what the Blair government has been doing is been saying to the Muslim community, it's fine, we're taking this issue seriously because we're going to allow Muslims to have city academies. And actually there's been a proposal for one up in Bradford just recently released, and this is, in a way, this is sullying the debate around the defence of comprehensive education, but I can't get into all that, I haven't time. Really what I want to do is look at what's best for Muslim youth. If we're talking about education and faith schools, what is really in the interests of our Muslim children? And when you go and look at the government's own data, one of the most striking features of it is that the children, and I'll give you the figures here, it isn't an issue of faith or race alone. It is an issue of class and poverty. And I want to just state to you, when we deal with schools, we look at the issue of free school meals as a measure of poverty. And if you look, the average number of, 14% is the average number of children with free school meals in a school. That's the average number amongst white kids. When it comes to Bangladeshi kids, 50% of Bangladeshi kids are on free school meals. Just under 50% of Pakistani kids are on free school meals. About 40% of black African kids are on free school meals. So the experience and the achievement of our children, our Muslim children, is determined in part by their social and economic status. And this is an issue that we've got to address. And it's an issue that in a lot of the debate around faith schools isn't really taken up. So that's another backdrop. And I know I've got very short time, so I want to think, just to try and conclude, is what are the issues, what can we do about this issue? And I want to just draw an analogy or comparison from the experience of Afro-Caribbean parents and children, because in the 1970s, 40 years ago, a man called Bernard Cord wrote a pamphlet that identified institutional racism in schools. Very serious institutional racism, and to be honest, that's institutional racism is still there. And one of the things that black parents did, Afro-Caribbean parents did, is they argued two main things, really. They argued for supplementary schools, schools after school to help support black children to develop their confidence in schools. The other thing they argued for was a thing we call Black History Month. And Black History Month was about promoting the identity and culture of Afro-Caribbean children. And I just want to give you an example of the impact this has had. And I'm not saying this is a simple and easy solution. If we just had Black History Month, everything will be all right. But when I first started teaching 12 years ago, I arrived in my school in Islington down the road here, and I said to the head teacher, to the head of history then, I want to teach about the slave trade. He says, you can't do that because that'll cause trouble. And I said to him, well, it may ruffle feathers, but we've got to deal with the issue of our history. This is a joint history. This is the history of our world. So what I want to argue with people today is that the issue of faith schools, really, whether they're separate or not, this will only attach to a minority of children. The vast majority of our Muslim children will be in the state sector. We have to have a strategy that begins to raise the consciousness and the well-being and the welfare of those children, and partly that means arguing for what I would call an Islamic history. And I've come here really to get ideas from you more than me give you ideas about how you see that. But I think that's a crucial issue in the debate around faith schools, is that we need an identity. We need to raise the identity of Muslim history, Islamic history, Islamic civilization, so that we're, this is a multicultural approach to our education. So I don't know whether I've done 5 minutes, but I don't want to go over my time. So thanks very much, and I look forward to questions.
I've already been introduced. For those who came a little bit late, my name is Rebecca Williams. I'm currently a Link Governor Trainer for Birmingham Local Authority. I am not advocating that a Muslim school is either a vessel of integration or isolation. I think the reality is somewhere in the middle or somewhere between that. I recognise that within some schools in the state sector in the UK, there is institutional Islamophobia. There is no doubt about that. We have come across that, although I would argue from my experience that in the majority of them, there is not. I think that instead of running away from any difficult issues we may face in non-Muslim state schools, we should, as a Muslim community, face them and combat them and attain the rights that we do require as Muslims. The things that make Muslims run away from state schools into the Muslim sector can be combated, such as the difficulties with collective worship, the difficulties with wearing hijab, and so on. I think that we need to take a step back and look at what we've achieved and look as a Muslim community at our strategy for the future for the children of our country. And if I just divide the children of our country into, say, 3 very, very, very broad categories, you've got a very tiny minority of children who are from practicing Muslim families. So they're from families where, let's say, both parents are praying 5 times a day. Then you have significantly more children from Muslim families who may not be practicing. And there are various shades and levels of that, up to families that may be actually anti-Islamic. And then, of course, you have the vast majority of children in this country who are not Muslim. I think as a Muslim community, we need to look at all of those children and look at what we would like to do for them. Firstly, we'd like to keep the Muslim children from practicing families practicing. That's obvious. For us who have children, we want our children to grow up within the faith, praying, at least doing the basics of Islam, and hopefully a little more. For those children who are from a Muslim background, but maybe not a background that practices Islam as such, we would like them to know about Islam. We'd like them to maybe think about taking up their faith and practicing it. And as for those non-Muslim children, we would like them to receive, not to convert them, we would like them to receive the message of Islam in its true form and not in a distorted form. And my question is, are Muslim schools really the way to do that? As it has been mentioned, Muslim schools cater for a tiny minority of Muslim pupils, with over 80% of Muslim pupils being in non-Muslim state schools. The majority of these Muslim schools are not state-funded, they are private. The fact that they're private means, in my opinion, that many of these private schools whose parents are fee-paying would be likely to get higher results, just as private schools in any sector get higher results. I think that my opinion is that we need to choose the best education for our children, we need to face up to any difficulties with state schools, and we need to overcome them. In the methodology of raising an Islamic society, I don't understand the idea of putting children in a Muslim school and thinking that that will make them a practicing Muslim. From my experience, and it would be extremely useful to have a study done, but from my experience, children from strong practicing Muslim families tend to grow up to be strong practicing Muslims, even if they are the only Muslim in their school. And I can give you lots of examples of that. Whereas children from families who are maybe not as practicing maybe don't grow up as strong. And I think that Muslim schools need to tell us if they are making much difference to that. The reality is that children still tend to follow what their parents are doing. Nor can we say that Muslim schools are full of angels in either the teachers or the children, but they also reflect the problems that we have in the Western society. Sorry to say this, there are also boyfriends and girlfriends in Muslim schools. There are also children swearing in Muslim schools. There is also a lack of respect for authority in all schools, and this is a thing that we need to combat. My understanding of the way to combat this is through purifying the individual, purifying the family and the home, and making a community that wants to raise a child. That's my way, my understanding of how to combat these problems. I don't think Muslim schools have necessarily done that. I do, however, feel very strongly that we should support schools such as Darul Ulooms that exist for the purpose of training Islamic scholars and giving them Islamic knowledge, because we do need a certain proportion of our children, although it will be a small proportion, to gain the Islamic knowledge, to gain the knowledge of sciences and to become Islamic scholars. What I'm talking about really is non-Muslim schools. I would like to see our efforts focused on changing the non-Muslim state schools around us. For example, if I was to ask you who it was that decided a uniform policy for schools, or PE policy for uniform, or whether it is segregated, or whether swimming is segregated, or what the sex education policy is, or exactly who they hire, it would be the governors. And instead of perhaps putting all of our time and effort into trying to raise Muslim schools, it's very, very hard to get a new school off the ground. Perhaps we should look into becoming governors at state schools. Because as governors, we can decide the uniform policy, and we can decide the other policies that we need. I would just finish quickly by saying that moral values are not just confined to Muslim schools, and there are a lot of schools out there that do teach moral values. It would be wrong to say that they didn't. There are also a lot of state schools that are extremely good towards Muslim pupils. For example, my son, who is 7, is pretty much the only Muslim in his school. And when he arrived, the teacher said it was absolutely fine for him to pray 5 times a day. He's been given that. They've got halal meetings specially for him, given me the certificate from National Halal Meat Centre that they've got it from there, and made a lot of other adjustments. He's had the opportunity a number of times to talk to the school about Islam. In my youngest son's school, which is also a village school with very few Muslims, I've been able to come in a lot of times to talk about Islam. And the children, when I went to year 4, knew all of the 5 pillars of Islam and were extremely engaged. I was able to achieve a lot more through that. Some of the teachers asked me, could you write hello in Arabic? So I wrote Assalamu alaikum, and I translated peace be with you. And then all the teachers kept coming up to me because they wanted it in their classrooms. Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. And this is a village school with pretty much only 1 or 2 Muslims. So I think we should be walking towards that and looking to get involved in state schools as governors, rather than attempting to do something that is pretty much impossible, and that is put all the Muslims in the UK into Muslim schools.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu salam ala sayyidil mursaleen. Greet you with the universal greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. One of the disadvantages of speaking first is that you don't know what everybody else is going to say. One of the advantages of coming later is you've got a few things to hang on to. First of all, I'd like to say that I think it's the wrong question which is being asked. My sister mentioned there, as if it's a choice between integrationist and isolationist by having a Muslim school. And I would say that, first of all, this word integration, if we're talking in terms of a democracy, the word integration shouldn't even be mentioned. If I want to walk around with pink hair and pins through my ears and nose and every other part of me, as long as I don't hurt anybody else, what's the problem? But there seems to be a problem when it comes to Muslims standing up and saying, we're Muslims. And we believe that Islam has something to say, that Islam has something to contribute in every aspect of our life. And we cannot leave the education of our children out of that equation. And when the sister mentioned just now that 80%, I would probably say it's more than 80%, of Muslim children are actually in the state sector, then I would ask the question, why the fuss about Muslim schools? Why is everybody getting so upset about Muslim schools? Why is it okay for us to have our Muslim media, for us to have Muslim social organizations, Muslim organisations, welfare organisations. Why is it okay to have this, but the minute we stand up and say Muslim schools, suddenly it's divisive, it's isolationist, etc., etc. And I would suggest that the fact that there is this sort of fuss being made for such a small number of children being educated within the independent and now also state-funded Muslim school movement is the fact that it illustrates the power of education. A number of years ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, when the argument was going, there was a big argument raging about whether planning permission should be given for mosques in this country because the communities were starting to settle and decide to build mosques. And the then Archbishop of Canterbury turned around and said, don't worry, let them have their mosques, we've got their children in our schools. The power of education is enormous, and we should not and cannot dismiss very lightly the hidden curriculum of the teachers. Yes, there are brilliant examples of good practice all over the country. There is a teacher here in this hall today who I know is in a state school. There are some brilliant work going on, but I would suggest that the bad far outweighs the good. We still get Muslim children being asked during Ramadan, why are you starving yourself? We still get all the problems with hijab. We get all sorts of issues being raised. But I would go further and say, when we're talking about halal food, well, it's not an issue anymore. Wearing the scarf generally is not an issue anymore. We dealt with this 20 years ago. Anybody's got problems with halal food, bring your sandwiches and your samosas from home, for goodness sake. It's halal knowledge that we're talking about. And what should be, in the case of a Muslim school, is that we're actually educating a child to understand that their Islam is more than just wearing a cap and a scarf and having a beard. That their Islam goes beyond that. That you cannot keep Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of the science lesson, out of the maths lesson, out of the history lesson. British history is interesting that Alistair's a history teacher. That's my subject. History. Britain has an incredible Islamic history going back 1,200 years. Do our kids know about that in school? No, they don't. In a Muslim school, we teach them that. We teach them when they're looking at the Romans. Well, the Romans are mentioned in the Quran. Did you know that? We're teaching about the Anglo-Saxons. Did you know that the Muslims are already coming to this country at the time of the Anglo-Saxons? When we're teaching about the Tudors, did you know that Queen Elizabeth was trying to get a treaty together with the Ottomans in the Mediterranean against the Catholics? When we talk about Victorians, did you know that when the Victorians were going out and the imperialism was going out, it was the Muslim world that they was in contact with? And that's from the Victorian time is when we can actually trace the beginning of the settlement of Muslims in this country. It didn't happen 50 years ago, it didn't happen 40 years ago, it happened nearly 200 years ago. Do our kids know this? They don't get this in the state schools. Black History Month is a great thing, but it needs to be brought and expanded and moved away. And people should stop being afraid of having religion in the classroom. Faith is the forbidden F word in most state schools. Faith and religion is pushed to one side. It's isolated, it's marginalized. And we need to try and make sure that this comes back again. And I believe, and I've been working with Muslim schools since 1984, that a good, strong Muslim school in an area has an automatic effect on the local state schools, because those state schools have to start doing something for their Muslim pupils, otherwise they're going to lose those pupils to the Muslim school. So the good Muslim school in the area will actually have that effect of improving the provision. And teachers know this, and especially these days where schools have very much a control over their own budgets. If they start to lose pupils, they lose money. Lose money, they've got to start laying staff off, and it's a downward spiral. So a good Muslim school in the area can actually improve the situation for Muslim children in a state school. And when we're talking about isolationism as if we're hiding our children from the realities of life, well, nobody lives in a vacuum. And Muslims these days, we're not allowed to live in a vacuum. All this thing about integration. Well, I'm sorry, but it shouldn't even be mentioned, this word. What are we integrating into? If we're talking about involvement and interaction, that's a different issue. And I believe that all good Muslim schools, and not all are good, I'm first to admit that, all good Muslim schools will have links with local state schools, will have exchanges between pupils and teachers, and working together to develop the children. And that in a faith school, whether it's a Muslim school or not, the children can come in and feel that they are valued. It's not a tradition, it's not a culture, it's a faith of the family. And this is very important. It really bugs me something rotten when I hear about the different faith traditions and the culture. Yes, these are part of it, but faith goes deeper than that. And I don't think that it's fair to expect Muslim children to take off their faith, like they take their coats off when they enter the school gates. I think it's very important, and the Bullock Report in 1975, A Language for Life, recognised this fact, that children should not be expected to cast off the language and culture of the home as they cross the school threshold. So why should they be expected to cast off the faith of the home, or to put it to one side, or to keep it in the place where it's religious education and is put on a par with every other religion? I have great respect for people of other faiths. My family are people of other faiths, for goodness sake. So why should I disrespect them? The children I teach in my school also have incredible respect for others. And if they show disrespect, we try and correct them as quickly as possible. And I don't believe any faith will teach anybody to have disrespect for others, because practicing believers have an affinity with other practicing believers. When I see the whole fuss being made about Muslim schools particularly, and there's one of the words which Alistair mentioned before, separate schools. This word separate was never used in the faith school debate until Muslim schools came up. There were always other Jewish schools, Catholic schools, Anglican schools, but it was never separate schools. It was only when Muslim schools came up, that's when the word separate came out. And I think there's actually a bigger agenda at play here, that they're trying to actually undermine, to try and reduce the level. And they're prepared to throw the baby out with the bathwater, close Muslim schools down, close faith schools down, because we do not want Muslim schools. Why? You can ask yourselves the question. This whole program these few days is being put forward to try and address this issue, to try and make sure that people know about Islam, that Islam is not seen as some alien faith. Christianity was an alien faith here 2,000 years ago, for goodness sake. Why should it be any different when people are coming through and are serious about practicing a faith which enables the worship of God and the doing of good? Why is that seen as a great threat? We need to understand that with our faith schools, and our Muslim schools in particular, we're actually giving our young people this sense of identity, or we're trying to, a sense of self-esteem, so that they understand who they are. They know who they are. The late Rabbi Cyril Harris, who was Rabbi of South Africa, died a few months ago. He made it very clear, it's fine to have respect for others, but self-respect should come first. And I think that the Muslim school, if it's established correctly with the correct intention, is trying to make sure that children have self-respect, that they understand who they are and what they are, and that their Islam is a complete way of life. It's a cliche, I know, but it's true. And it is a complete way of life, and that we cannot exclude the education factor out of that. We have to have this included. And if we can do that when they get to 15, 16 and start to go into further and higher education, I believe that they are a stronger base of understanding who they are and what they are, and are better equipped to be able to cope with whatever life throws at them. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Brother Ibrahim is a difficult act to follow with all that experience. But I'd like to begin by just emphasizing really the whole idea and the whole debate about Muslim schools, and like to endorse what Brother Ibrahim said. But I think going beyond that, we have 120, 130 Muslim schools now registered, and they are at a very early stage in their development, very, very early stage. And some of the schools are very fledgling schools, they can hardly crawl in that sense. So some of the criticism that is sometimes leveled against Muslim schools, for that reason, I feel is very, very unfair, because it takes a long time to establish a school for it to flourish and become very strong. But I think that in the future, we would want Muslim schools to not just only take children who are of the Islamic faith background, but for them to be such a quality product, a product which will attract children from other faiths as well, and that the other parents would want to send their children to Muslim schools. We had such an example in one of the schools where in one of the schools they received 2 applications from non-Muslim parents who happened to live in the neighborhood. So they received 2 applications, and the faith schools, they enter children against entry criteria, and you have to be of the faith background and so on. So there's no chance of, because of the shortage of places, for 30 places, you get 1,000 applications. There's no possibility of somebody who's not of the Islamic faith background to actually get in. So there is a huge demand for that. So the school was really intrigued by this, so they invited the people in. They said, well, you know, you have applied, and we are honored that you have applied, but this is our criteria, but we were intrigued to meet you. So they met them and they said, why have you applied to this Muslim school? And they said, well, we see your children outside. We live in the neighborhood. We've never had any trouble from any of your children. We've not been sworn at by them. We've not actually been insulted by them. No graffiti or anything like that. And we are actually impressed with your children and their behavior. And we think that we would like our daughters, it was 2 girls, they said we would like our daughters, in fact, to be like these girls here. And therefore, we know that you're a good product, and we want to send your children to your school. So we hope that in the future, Muslim schools would be strong enough to really have the capacity as well to take in children from other faiths. So we don't believe in isolation, because Islam is a universal religion, and we believe in universalism in that sense. So we have to be welcoming of other children and be part of the society in its fullness. But I'd like to take you also actually to a very basic question, because everybody uses the word education, but it can mean different things to different people. What is your understanding about education? And what are the aims and the purposes of education? Because ultimately what education is going to be dictated by its purpose. In other words, your worldview. What do you think is the reality of this world? What is the purpose of your life in this world? And it is connected with that. And that's not something that, that I'm sort of just making up for myself, but Islamically speaking, I suppose, the purpose of education would be to impart beneficial forms of knowledge in a manner that will help the individual to attain success in this life and the hereafter. Not just in this life, and the hereafter as well. We want our children to be educated to be good Muslims and good citizens and good people who have good character and who are good neighbors. That is what it's about. It's not just about getting a job, because there's a lot of discussion about, and people use the language, and people think, well, attainment is education. Attainment is not the same thing as education. It is one critical part of education, but it isn't education itself. Because if that was the case, then we had the famous doctor, Harold Shipman. How many people have heard of Harold Shipman? Yeah, Harold Shipman had excellent degrees, grade A's and all the attainment things that he had. But morally, spiritually, as a human being, he was completely bankrupt. He had nothing to offer to anybody. He ended up killing loads of women and was just executing them because he felt that, that they were consuming resources which could be better spent, or whatever his reason was. So the point is that it's about the development of the whole person. The character development is the key to all of that. So it's development of the whole child. It's not simply about attainment. Just because you have good results doesn't mean that you're necessarily educated in the Islamic sense in that sense. It is about character, it's about refinement, it is about carrying yourself in a certain way, it is about politeness, it is about your quality of interaction with other individuals, with members of your own family, and with wider society. One who is educated is necessarily of a good, refined character, and is a credit to society. So it really depends on what your notions are of what education is. And we have to ask this question, because education can be different to different people. The national curriculum has 2 aims, and rightfully it has 2 aims, and they are, and I'll go through the first one, which is to prepare pupils at the school for opportunities, responsibilities, and experiences of adult life. That is to do with giving them the opportunity to develop skills that will be important for life, and things like progressing onto university and being able to get a job and being successful in that arena. The second aim of national curriculum is to promote the spiritual, moral, social, cultural, and mental development of pupils at the school and of society. So education systems are also about constructing societies. And this is an important dimension to remember. How is it that you want your children to be educated? It's a very important what model and what sort of exposure your children have in terms of values, in terms of culture, in terms of worldview even. And I quote here from Beliefs, Behavior and Education from Roger Stroughton, he's an education writer. Education essentially aims to alter both mental and physical behavior. That's what education is. It alters mental and physical behavior, how people behave. Successful education must, by definition, affect how people think and judge and assess and deliberate, and how they draw conclusions and make decisions and how they act. That is what education is. So the type of education that your children receive, this is what education does to the child. So education isn't some sort of neutral activity in that sense. It is against the backdrop of values. And those values and those exposures that children get from which they learn and the experiences and so on must be wholesome, must be healthy for them to grow up as individuals who are a true credit to society. And from a Muslim point of view, they have to be good Muslims. We want our children to be educated to be good Muslims, necessarily. And that is good for society. I mean, I finished by giving one example from what we're talking about here. Theory is fine, but what are we talking about when we say compare, say, I don't know, the Muslim school sector, which is a very tiny sector, compared to, say, children that go to the state school. I'll give you an example. I received a call from a teacher, this is about 6 months ago, and this is illustrative. I'm giving one example here, and he gave me a call at about 4 o'clock. And he's a teacher in a school which has sort of 95, 96% Muslim pupils, a state school, primary school. He gave me a ring and he said, Tahir, you know, I was quite shocked today. I said, why are you shocked? And he said, well, I teach 7-year-olds. 7-year-olds. In the particular class, all the children are of the Islamic faith background. And he said, and he's an NQT as well. And he said, I was teaching them, and one of the things that I started with them was that when you begin the lesson, because they're Muslim children, to recognize them, I normally begin the lesson by saying, Assalamu alaikum. And all the children, you know, in primary schools, as they do, say, Wa alaikum salam, mister, that sort of thing. Quite normal in primary schools, those of you who've been in schools. He said, this is how I used to begin the class, just recognizing who the children are, their background, and valuing them. And he said, one of the days, at the same time in the morning, 9 o'clock, a senior member of management team walked into the school, who was not Muslim, but senior member of management team. She walked into the school and I began my lesson as usual. Assalamu alaikum, children, and good morning as well. He does both. He said, Assalamu alaikum, children, and not a single child said, Wa alaikum assalam. Not one. And he thought this was quite normal, and everybody's saying Wa alaikum salam all the time. Why aren't they saying it? Then he repeated that again. Then a few more children murmured. He said, I noticed that the children were looking at me and they're looking at the other member of staff, looking at me and looking at the other member of staff. In other words, who should they try to please? Who should they respond to? Whose expectation they should respond to? My point is this, that there is scope for, we can have an education system which does respond very positively to the needs of Muslim pupils. And this 96% of our children, to make the correction really, for the second time, the 96% of Muslim children go to the state school sector. There is a tremendous need for that provision to be made far more friendlier. Muslim children should not have to discard and give up their sense of identity, their sense of belonging, and should be able to be educated in the fullness of their being, just like all other children, regardless of who they are. So I think we want an education system which actually respects and values all children, and Muslim children as well as every other child. Whatever their faith background may be, should be valued and respected equally within the educational context to whatever extent possible. So, I mean, these are important challenges, but I think it's important that we construct and go together really, because education systems are about managing the future of society and country as a whole. And it is for that reason that there should be flexibility, there should be tolerance, and that there should be a right degree of diversity, if you like, of provision, which responds to the requirements of parents, so that parents can educate their children according to their wishes, which is a fundamental right of parents to do that, not for the state to actually push certain types of agenda. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair.
I think I did worse, didn't I? Yeah, on time there.
Right. So we're now giving the audience the opportunity to ask questions. So we've got a helper here to take a microphone.
With the mic there.
Right. Would you like to start on that side, please? To the extremes.
There's a school kid over there who should
Yes.
speak.
I think all the panel have spoken a lot of sense. And it's particularly good to see that everybody's keen to widen the debate beyond purely the integration issue and to bring in other aspects of it. I think that's something to be applauded. It's good also that Mr. Hewitt has referred to the language element as well, because there's remarkable parallels between Welsh medium schools and what's going on with religious-based schools. However, I'd like to ask Mr. Hewitt to just a question a bit further, to expand on how he feels you can completely disregard the problem, the perceived problem of non-integration with Muslim schools.
Bismillah. The perceived thing about non-integration, I think it's actually an agenda against faith. Not specifically against Muslim schools, but we are the vehicle, if you like, for attacking faith. And I think it's a wider issue, and it's not, if we look at it from the Muslim point of view, it's haqq against batil, it's truth against falsehood. And I think this is part of that whole process. That it's an attempt to try and denigrate faith, to push faith to one side, which is quite ironic when you consider you've got George Bush, who professes to be very much faith-driven, Tony Blair professes to be very much faith-driven in every sense, but this thing against Muslim schools, I really don't know. People say, well, it's the anti-Muslim thing. I don't like to take on the victim mentality. Sister mentioned before that we're running away from the system. Well, running away from an unresponsive state system would be a perfectly good reason, in my view, to start a Muslim school. But I feel that many Muslim schools are now being established from the positive side of Islamic education, to give the complete perspective of Islamic education, rather than saying, we don't want that, but we don't know what we want. Saying, this is what we want, and the schools are open to anybody. So I think it's actually part of the denigration of Muslim schools is a convenient excuse for people to have a go at faith generally. And we saw this in the reports after the riots up north a few years ago, when faith schools were blamed. Muslim schools were cited as a factor for this disintegration of the social structures up in Oldham and Bradford. Well, one thing is almost certain that didn't come out of this, but I could almost guarantee that those young people lobbing petrol bombs and bricks at each other didn't go to a Muslim school. They went to the local state schools. So to me, they're looking in the wrong direction for the wrong answers. You want to reform society, you need to reform education. And I think faith still plays such an important part in people's lives that you cannot ignore that as a factor and a basis for the education of the children, to give people a rounded personality instead of telling them that this part of their life, which they consider so important, is actually not that important when they go to school. And I can understand why the Welsh language schools are feeling the same thing. But I think it's all part, and historically, if you look at it, it's the oppression of the English. And that's a different story, but we need to look at that. Yeah?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to the panel. As a parent and a committee member of a small charity in Reading, I've tried to organize the equivalent of Black History Month in our area as a small way to educate Muslim and non-Muslims alike and to supplement the education of the children, the local children. However, this has met my resistance by the local council, and I can't get funding from the usual sponsors because it is deemed as promoting religion. If I did this event as an Asian arts or the equivalent, only then it is supported. How can a small local initiative like this go forward faced with such obstacles?
I'm fascinated to hear your experience there, because one of the ironies of it is if you look at a lot of the Black History Month stuff that's done in schools is all cultural events, and some of it's shockingly unhistorical, which strikes me as complete hypocrisy in your case. And it's something, I mean, it kind of backs up what I'm saying. I think we need to go to local authorities and schools and say we want to do Islamic history in, whether it's Islamic History Month, it should be part of the mainstream of our history curriculum, because it's a fundamental, you can't address science the history of science without addressing the Islamic world. You can't have an understanding of the modern world without having an understanding of the Islamic civilizations. So, you know, it's a fundamental requirement of historical knowledge. That's why I think we've got to pile in on that argument, and wherever we're on governing bodies, we should be making that argument. Just one little addendum to that. Tony Blair this week said, Muslim youth have this is his words, a completely false sense of grievance against the West. Well, I'm not sure that's true, Tony, because would he say that about black youth? Would he say that about Afro-Caribbeans having a false sense of grievance about slavery? I don't think he would dare say that, because he'd be smashed down. There is a sense of grievance because the history of the Islamic world is not shared anywhere, and that's a real sense of grievance. But then there's Palestine, there's Iraq. Look at the maps in the Middle East and you'll see what the West did in the Middle East. And unless we address that history in the mainstream of our schools, we're doing a disservice to Muslim youth, but we're also a disservice to white youth. They need to know the real reasons for what is going on in our society. And Islamic History Month would be one way of addressing that. That's what I feel, anyway.
Sister asked a very important question, how you tackle that, really. And there is a way of tackling those things, and something that, you know, many people have been doing, and doing it successfully as well. And that is to speak openly about that. Because one of the things that I always encountered when I had interactions with schools, and I've been governor in schools for many, many years, is this idea that faith is something that should be kept out. I mean, basically, this is the premise against which people are operating. They're saying, faith, keep it out. Bring the culture in, if you like, the food, the dress, and those sort of things. So cultural inclusion is counted as, you know, as a samosa, yeah? Bring the samosa in with some curry in, and there we got cultural inclusion. A very tokenistic, you know, superficial type inclusion. Now, you have to deal with the issue of the mind. The Muslim child needs to be recognized. And the need actually for in schools where there is no Muslims at all, for them to understand, you know, Muslims and Islam, the true understanding of Islam is extremely important. Not just for our society here, but it's important for the world, as we very well know, because the world is increasingly becoming smaller and smaller. So it's very important that that happens. But how you tackle that particular issue, you have to insist, basically, and you have to continue with that. In other places where we have actually raised those things, eventually, of course, people will, I mean, to begin with, people will fob you off and say, well, no, there's no need for that, this sort of thing. But you have to persist, and you have to get into positions of responsibility. So the people who make decisions on schools, for example, are governors. The governorship from say, the Muslim community, nationally, these are my own dodgy little figures, if you like, in that sense, yeah. But they aren't based on anecdotal survey, but I have been actually to almost all major cities, and I do understand, you know, what's happening in those areas because I've been working with the Muslim community. And I know that the highest number of representation that we got for Muslims being involved on governing bodies, where you make decisions about those sort of things, is about 1/3 is the highest we picked up. And the normal average is about quarter of what it should be. So for example, if you take a school which has, say, I don't know, 90% Muslim pupils, you will find that there is about 3 or 4 Muslim governors sitting there, and that'll be the end of that. You don't have a decisive say or very influential say over what the policy is going to be. So in terms of inclusion, Black History Month, the Islamic, within Key Stage 3, for example, there is opportunities to study contributions of the Islamic civilization, you know, to the world, and that can be up to 22 lessons at Key Stage 3. How many schools? The question would be, in London Borough of Tower Hamlets, which has 70% of its pupils from Muslim communities, how many schools in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets teach Islamic contribution of the Islamic civilization in those schools? Would be an interesting little survey to do. It would also be an interesting survey to do in Bradford and so on. So to bring about change, you need more Muslims to go into the teaching profession as well, so that they perform a wider educational role. They can be role models and educate the educators, if you like, in a wider sense. So more Muslims in the teaching profession and more governors involved with the governing body, where the policy is made, where the curriculum is decided, and those sort of things. So it's very, very important that we engage those areas to bring about change.
Great question. Absolutely great question.
Another question, please.
Doing that. I'm going to find out.
Hi. Well, I really liked all the speeches. However, I think perhaps this really goes to Mr. Ibrahim Hewitt. And if I may give a background to it, when my children came to the age that obviously they had to go to school, and we started thinking about this with my wife, we were presented with 3 criteria that we thought were key. Good ethics, good education, and crucially the presence of faith. That whatever school we choose not only gave those ethics, gave that good education, but allowed for faith to develop. Now, my wife was very unkeen for an Islamic school, having grown up in Sweden and seeing the experience of Muslim schools in Scandinavia, which in the integration field, they were a disaster. Language was not taught, Swedish language levels were very poor, educational levels were poor. Basically, it was a total collapse of the system, so much that now you cannot speak of Muslim schools in Scandinavia without a laugh. However, when we came here in London to look for the schools, we found that we were being presented with the Muslim alternative to the Christian fundamentalist school, where our children will not just grow up with ethics and faith, but also with indoctrination. And as an example, just here, that's actually present here in the conference, we have a Muslim school that presents as part of its Islamicity a Muslim-friendly uniform, and uniform that respect the Muslim values, salwar kameez. Yet 80% of the students are from Somalia. When it came to the study of the Islamic curriculum, we realized that neither our madhab, neither our different points of view in some aspects of Islamic history, nothing else was actually represented there. And we realized that we were better off sending our child to a Catholic school, to a Protestant school, or just any other school except a Muslim school. And then again, I concurred with this, since I grew up in a Catholic school, came from a Catholic school, both my uncles are Catholic priests, yet I am a Muslim. Furthermore, just to conclude in this sense, praise be to God, we did find a school that presented an alternative that unfortunately I think is not being followed up by most Muslim schools being set up. An offer for a good environment, with good ethics, good education, an Islamic environment, yet no religion actually taught. Quran is learned, Arabic is learned, but no matters of indoctrination are there. For whoever wants it, Saturday is an extra day, they can come and learn each his own madhab.
Obviously, I cannot comment on individual schools. And I mentioned, there's 120. You said most Muslim schools. You use this as if you've been to and seen most Muslim schools. Yeah, there are going to be difficulties. Yes, there are schools, and we had it in the state system in Luton a couple of years ago, Denby High School, where the uniform which had been negotiated with the local community was shalwar kameez. And one girl came along and said, well, actually, this doesn't suit me. Right? So the state system has these problems as well. And it's one of these things where no school is getting it right, 100%. No school. I tell my staff, and I've told the parents, the day I come in and say, this school is brilliant, this school is perfect, you lock me up and you throw away the key. Because every school can make changes, and a school has to be responsive to the parents and has to understand the catchment area and the parents it's dealing with. And so, yeah, I can empathize with some of the things that you complain about, particularly the uniform aspect, the terms of the Islamic studies, the madhab, which particular one do you follow and not follow. These things should be neutral as far as possible. And a good school will do this, and increasingly they are. So I understand your frustration, and I sense your frustration, and I apologize and feel sorry that you weren't able to be accommodated in the school that you originally chose. But I think it would be very unfair to tar all state schools with, because you see this one school which is failing, say that all schools are failing. I think it's a bit unfair to say that Muslim schools per se, would give the sort of experience to parents that you've gone through. I think it's down to the head. And then on the issue where Tahir mentioned and Sister was mentioning before about getting in as governors, I used to live not far from here, and I was a governor at a local school. And it was my experience then, and I still feel it's very common, that the most important person in the school is not the governors, it's the head teacher. If the head teacher wants something to happen or doesn't want something to happen, regardless of what the governors say, regardless in some cases what the government says, that thing will or will not happen. The key person is the head teacher. And I think this is a very important factor that when we do get involved, we have to understand that as a governor, you've got the choice and the power over the employment and what have you, and you must push the heads. Many times governors feel, well, we don't want to go through trying to recruit the head and he's okay or she's okay in this particular area, and they won't push issues with the head teacher if the head teacher says no. And we have to stand up as governors and as parents and realise that we actually have many, many rights over our schools these days, and try and make sure that the education does reflect what we want, and so that, according to the law, children are educated according to the wishes of the parents. Sean.
Could we give a voice to the young person who's sitting at the back there, please?
Assalamu alaikum. I'm a 16-year-old student and I've just done my GCSEs, and I haven't gone to faith schools. I am Pakistani. And one of the things that I really strongly believe in is that we have to understand our peers who are non-Muslims. We have to understand why some of my friends go on Saturday night, get drunk, only to wake up on Sunday with a headache every single Saturday night repeatedly. Now, what happens all too often, especially with kids who I know who go to faith schools, is that instead of understanding them, they demonize non-Muslim children. They don't actually integrate with society. They just say, okay, that's them, this is me, we are separate, okay? I believe that if you put Muslim students into non-Muslim schools, Muslim students will understand non-Muslim kids, and then it's only once you understand them that you can then preach to them, or not preach, but at least teach them your ways. Because I believe that if you want to decrease ignorance, you have to put more Muslim students into mainstream schools. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I also wanted to touch very much on the previous question to that one. I think my personal opinion is that as a Muslim community, we should be searching for the very, very best academic education for our children, first and foremost. And I believe that the child's Islamic identity will come primarily from the home as well as the community in which they are raised, not necessarily from the school. In addition to this, we must also, of course, choose a school that upholds and acknowledges their Islamic identity. And there are schools that will not do that, but they are in the minority. I think that education is a very, very wide thing. It's not just about grades, and there are some schools that do offer an absolutely excellent education. It's those schools often that the leader of the local authority in the sisters area will have gone through. And I'd rather see Muslims getting the very, very best academic education available to them, alongside a strong Islamic identity imparted primarily at home and from the community. Then they can be the directors of the LEA, then they can be the head teachers in the school, then they can be the teachers in the school, and then we wouldn't have this problem. But what we do need to do is raise the Muslim community out from its cycle of educational underachievement.
Just to the last question, brother over there. First of all, I thought it was very interesting that you declared yourself to be a Pakistani, not to be a Muslim, which is, you know, I'm not Pakistani, but I'm a Muslim. So I thought it was very interesting that you put it that way. I don't mean to personalize it, but I think you have to look at where we're coming from on these issues. The other thing is about, for children, for young people in schools, there's a sister I know very well who's now, mashallah, she's a mum and everything's doing her PhD. She went to a Muslim school in the formative years when the school was struggling. She got excellent grades. She ended up at Oxford. She did a first-class honours degree in English. She did her master's degree. She's now doing her PhD. And when I asked her, because she's very bright, I said, would you feel you would have done the same in, say, the local state school as you did in the Muslim school? She said, no, I don't think so, because her sisters all went to the local state school. And she said she was free of the sort of pressures which they faced in the state school to wear hijab and pray and all that sort of thing. She was free of that. and she just concentrated and got on with her studies. Now, obviously there are individuals, and the danger in this debate is to use generalizations, because there are exceptions, whether it's good schools, good parents, bad parents, good pupils, not so good pupils. There are exceptions. It's very dangerous to generalize, and I think part of the problem we face with the Muslim schools debate is that there are huge sweeping generalizations, as highlighted by the title of the talk, you know, vessels of integration or isolation. And I think we have to be very careful on these things and look at the whole picture in context, inshallah, and be a bit more open to the other viewpoints, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Well, we have to bring this discussion to a close now. We're well over our scheduled time. Jazakallah khairan for attending and for contributing. We're very sad that we can't take any more questions, but no doubt you'd be able to find some of the speakers in the crowds, you know, after this session. So thank you very much, and assalamu alaikum from all of us.